Good morning, good morning. You are about to reach the last station of our Feelycraft ride. You are about to arrive to Range DPS Town. Range DPS are indeed the last ones we are going to be analyzing completely, objectively, just based on our feelings, on our intuition, and our gut reaction without any need for numbers, analysis, theory crafting, or actually data-based opinions. This is a safe space. You don't need to worry about smart people coming in here. So when we look at the performances of the range DPS coming into Shadowlands throughout the beta in all these past months, the general consensus has been more or less that Affliction, Shadow Priest and Frost Mage have been the better performers. For both Mythic Plus and Raids, there hasn't been much of a difference in range DPS between the two. Unlike for melee and for tanks and healers as well, it is way more uniform. Fire Mage and Demonology are still at the bottom. You have a big clump of very balanced and rather healthy specs like Arcane, Elemental, BM, Balanced Druid, and some better performers in between the strongest and the middle of the pack like Destruction, like Marksmanship. The only outlier between the changes from one type of content to the other is BM Hunter, being considerably weaker in Mythic Plus than they are in Raids due to their target cap issues, Beast Cleave being capped at 5 targets, and their only AoE legendary, Soulforge Embers, also being capped at 5 targets, definitely weakens them in AoE. So when we look at this rather objective and impartial analysis, what can we add of our own opinion? What can we add that is completely unfounded but we just feel like it? Let's start with Hunters. So I don't know what the deal is with BM Hunters, what the deal is with BM Hunter players. They seem to be weirdly zealous towards their spec for some reason. Or they have some weird hate towards marksmanship. They just refuse to play it by principle. Because my call, from what I've seen, is that despite currently marksmanship being essentially a better version of BM Hunter will remain the more popular spec. At the very least, similar to Marksmanship Hunter. And I can't quite put my finger on why every time I go back on it. If you have seen my melee video about this, I mentioned something similar for Rogues. Even if Subtlety would be popular, there would be still a lot of Outlaw and Assassination players. But for Hunter, Marksmanship and BM Hunter do not have a drastically different or polarizing playstyle, which would make sense for you to only play BM and just refuse to play Marksmanship. Because the problem as of right now is that BM Hunter has very good single target, but Marksmanship is better, and BM Hunter has very strong cleave, but so does Marksmanship. With the killer being what I mentioned at the start of this video, BM Hunter essentially has very poor AoE, whereas Marksmanship has volley, and partially trick shots as well. So there isn't really technically a reason to play BM Hunter right now. Yet, we will still see many BM Hunter players zealously defending their spec and just refusing to play Marksmanship. I don't know why. Please, BM players, join the comments and explain your reasoning, because so far to me it makes no sense. Please, just don't say that Marksmanship is boring to play and simple and easy because you're playing BM, okay? Just don't embarrass yourself. Now, moving on. But, you know what? Hunter was just an easy call, right? This was just a call about play rates. You know, it's not that ballsy. Let's make a call about power level. Let's go over to Mage. No, I'm not talking about Fire. We know Fire is dead. It doesn't need a gutsy call, a bold prediction to mention Fire being terrible at the release of the expansion. Fire is very reliant on gear, on stats, and they don't have any at the start of the expansion. They also lost massive amount of borrowed powers. So that was an easy call. That's not why we are here. We are here for Frost and Arcane, specifically Arcane related to the power of Frost. As you can all see right now in the pre-patch, Frost Mage is very powerful, very popular, very strong. And as it often happens in pure DPS classes, cannibalism. When one spec is particularly stronger than the other two drop massively in play rates. Consider the popularity of Fire Mage in Nyalotha in the last tier of BFA. Well, after the pre-patch, Fire Mage is now played 20 times less than Frost. Yeah, that's what happens. So the reason why I want to talk about Arcane is because I don't think that's going to be the case even when Frost will remain the better spec. This bold call is not about Arcane being better than Frost. I still think Frost is overall the best Mage spec, but I do think Arcane is being overlooked. And this is what happens, right, when Frost is so powerful. Who gives a shit about Arcane? Who even knows what Arcane does? All you're seeing around are Frost Mages, so it's very easy to undersell the power of Arcane, because it's easy to undersell it when nobody's fucking seeing it in the game. So why do I think it's better. It's going to be better. First of all, the thing you can hope for, if you are from a pure DPS class and you really hate playing another spec, even if it's stronger and you want to keep playing your own, is that you have a different damage profile. You know, do not end up like BM Hunter, doing the exact same damage as marksmanship, but marksmanship just does it better. That is bad, because then you will have much fewer reasons to make a case for your spec being worthwhile using, worthwhile taking. In the case of Arcane, they do have very powerful sustained single target damage, very powerful burst single target damage, and very powerful sustain and burst cleave. This is something that Frost Mage doesn't entirely have. You know, Frost Mage does have single target, but no burst. They do have cleave, but specifically limited to 2 targets, with their Splitting Eyes talent, which has recently gotten nerfed. What they also do have is single target, sustained single target, but it's only better than Arcane's if they can funnel, if they can hit multiple targets with their Frozen Orb, for example. Otherwise, if it's pure single target, then Arcane can do better. And for burst cleave, it's the same. Arcane is better, because Frost basically doesn't have burst. You know, Icy Veins doesn't even qualify as burst. There are, you know, many things that have made me look positively and made me have a good feeling about Arcane. Number one, of course, their mastery now makes them have an actual late game scaling that they didn't have before. Since now the mastery also affects all Arcane damage that wasn't there before, so that's already great. But more importantly, more in-depth. Pulling off their burst is much faster now, it's much easier. Now the Touch of the Magi has been given baseline and cooked in with charged up, so you can get to full charges instantly. With Touch of the Magi you do not require any build-up. Arcane Power is off the GCD and auto-casts Rune of Power. So this is going to save you a total of 2 GCDs and a cast of Rune of Power in your opener, which is effectively 4 GCDs, basically. Your Cleave, which is the point here that makes them very powerful, has been strengthened with Touch of the Magi baseline, with Arcane Echo or Resonance, and the legendaries you will be able to get, Arcane Harmony and Arcane Bombardment, particularly for execute phases, makes Arcane very powerful. I have already made a video for the damage profiles of Castronatria. There is going to be quite a bit of cleave, quite a bit of 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 targets, and that's where Arcane is going to be doing very well, particularly because it doesn't enter the weakness of Arcane, which is AoE. You know, full-on, blown-out AoE. Arcane is still pretty poor at that. It's just, you know, a list of positive changes pointing towards good types of damage profile that Arcane will be able to pull off in the raid, given the damage profile of the raid and the damage profile of Arcane. Other positive changes like Arcane Barrage refunding mana, meaning they are no longer forced to take Rule of 3, so that they can take Amplification, so they can open up more Arcane Missile based builds. All in all, I just see positive changes for Arcane. I feel like they are going to have their place in raid encounters. They won't just be relegated to being not a Frost Mage, so to speak. Now we take a break after this long portion on Mage to go back to play rates. The play rates of Shadow Priest. Because if you quiet down for a bit, you can actually listen and hear footsteps in the distance. Those are the footsteps of the people running to reroll Shadow Priest. The rumbling on the earth you are hearing is the gold rush to the flavor of the month spec. Shadow Priest is unquestionably the flavor of the month spec, beating Subtlety, beating Frost Mage, definitely the more hyped, due to also being, you know, completely reworked, and due to the fact that Shadow Priest over the years, not just months, not just tiers, over the years has accumulated a long list of zealous and devoted fans that have been hurt and heartbroken by Blizzard every single tier of every expansion, where they were promised a working Shadow Priest and then they were subsequently betrayed. And much like a Stockholm Syndrome, the more these people were betrayed by Blizzard, the more they stuck to Shadow Priest, hoping that the next tier would have been the tier to make Shadow Priest OP. It lasted for about half a tier at the start of Legion, and then they just got leveled down towards the bottom again. That's why I want to talk about Shadow Priest, because it's gonna have so much hype and so many more people playing Shadow Priest than you normally would guess, purely because it looks so strong right now. It does look strong in the pre-patch, but trust me, for months in the beta it looked even stronger. It does seem like the spec has been developed by, you know, a Shadow Priest fanboy, which is true, actually. Essentially trying to give Shadow Priest everything he has dreamed when he was in his little bedroom, thinking about ways to make his favorite spec OP, and he succeeded, you know. Syrian Nightmare, there you go. You've got your sustain plus burst AoE at the same time. Devouring Plague, there you go, you have your single target spender. It's a little bit weak. Make Devouring Plague stack on top of itself to make it even stronger. Shadow Word Death, of course, it can come back to be baseline, no problem. So the call I want to make for Shadow Priest is sort of like a horror movie, you know, a thriller. I have this feeling that someone is watching me, you know, that there is a great disaster coming, that I have entered this uncanny valley, where everything is just too pristine for Shadow Priest. There must be something wrong about the spec. I don't need numbers to tell me this, I don't need Theorycrafting, I just need my gut reaction to this, and my gut reaction feels wrong about Shadow Priest. There will be, eventually, a bump in the road that will make Shadow Priest stuck. That's my vision, because otherwise I have no other explanation. I cannot cope with the current state of Shadow Priest. The damage profile of Castanatria and the multitude of fights with several adds, especially weaker adds, you know, weaklings that you just mow down without much focus, sit so well with a spec like Shadow Priest that can spread cleave, dot cleave, so to speak, and then funnel all that spread dot cleave with Devouring Plague on single target. Devouring Plague being, by definition, a funnel ability, since reapplying Devouring Plague stacks the damage on top of the target anyways. So you don't even have to worry about overcapping on resources. You can just always dump it for more damage. It just works so well for Castanatria. The fact that you have multiple adds, dying, and now you have Shadow Word Death, baseline, even Twist of Fate you can use to take maximum value on these type of fights. You know, that's the only way I can explain Shadow Priest right now. The only way I can cope, especially because I'm playing ranged DPS, which won't be Shadow Priest. I have to find an explanation for all of this, and my only explanation I can give is just that it's gonna choke. You know, the house of cards, the house of dots is going to crumble, and Priest will be laid bare in its weaknesses. Remember, Priest still doesn't have an immunity, Priest still is very immobile, Priest doesn't give any raid debuffs or raid buffs, because Fortitude is gonna be brought by your local Discipline Priest that you have in your raid. Effectively, when you strip them of their damage, they bring nothing to the raid that you care about. That's my prophecy. The hour of Shadow Priest will not come. Now, remaining on the power level predictions, we move over to Affliction Warlock. I mean, we move by like 2 steps, because between Shadow and Affliction there is really just not much of a difference, both in terms of power and also in terms of damage profile. Surprisingly, doing a similar damage profile makes them extremely strong together. And this is where I go for my polarizing take. Despite being very similar, despite being both S tier and very powerful, I think where Shadow Priest will fall and crumble and fall to misery once again, Affliction actually won't. And Affliction will remain a very popular and very played and the strongest ranged DPS spec in Castanatria. Number one, because I am mean and I like seeing hybrid specs suffer. There is something ironic and quite funny in imagining the poor Shadow Priest with its lonely spec being nerfed and becoming less viable, while Affliction with its 3 different specs to choose from remains flavor of the month for 2 years. That's pretty funny. But also because I think, without needing to give you any explanation based on facts and logic, it just feels like Affliction has a more honest rotation. You know, a more honest way of doing damage. It's not unfair. It doesn't quite feel like cheating, you know, like playing Demon Hunter. It is also harder to play, at least when it comes to spread cleave, because they have more dots, they are shorter, they can't be refreshed as easily as Shadow Priests, so it also does require more focus to play, and I think they will stay at a very powerful level. And unlike Shadow Priest, they also have ways to remain very wanted in a raid. Warlock has never been a spec that was always gated from entering a raid because of their damage only. They still have a Hellstone, they still have a combat res, and they still have portals. And possibly in Shadowlands they also have curses now. So they are in a much better position when it comes to being wanted in a raid, and partially, but not really as importantly, in Mythic Plus because of the utility they bring, unlike Shadow Priest. So looking at the top tier of range specs for Shadowlands, when Affliction and Shadow Priest clash, my chips will be on Affliction instead of Shadow Priest. You know, myself having been a Priest main for over 3 expansions, it's also probably biased at not wanting to see Shadow Priest become OP flavor of the month the expansion I'm not actually playing it. That would piss me off. And this couldn't have been a Feelycrafty video if I didn't close the video with my own spec, Elemental Shaman. This is the only video where I get to be completely biased and completely subjective, where I get to tell you why is Elemental Shaman the best spec in the game. So, Elemental Shaman is going to be very powerful in Castanatria. Main reason is because, well, if it isn't, I lose my raid spot. So, yeah. You know, Elemental Shaman has been rather ignored in the pre-patch. A lot of people have been forming opinion purely by seeing what was going on in the pre-patch. a lot of people's opinions on Affliction Warlocks and Arcane Mages and Shadow Priests, which weren't powerful before the pre-patch, weren't powerful before the changes, right? Affliction wasn't being played, Destruction was. Arcane Mage wasn't being played, Fire Mage was, right? Elemental Shaman has also been one of the better performing specs in the pre-patch, right? But nobody seems to care. They haven't really increased in play rate by that much. They are still sort of went under the radar, mostly. And I think it will likely continue in Shadowlands. They will actually do better, they will continue to actually be one of the better performing specs. Number one, what you have already seen in the pre-patch is because a lot of specs have been losing a lot of borrowed powers that they really wanted, but Elemental Shaman really didn't. Elemental Shaman didn't have very game-defining, spec-defining, rotation-defining borrowed powers. When Shadowland hits and you lose Azerite traits as well, Elemental's not gonna give a shit, as opposed to many of these other well-performing specs. I do think they do have a very good damage profile for Castellnatria, and they are still very powerful for Mythic Plus. Echoes of Great Sundering is still an insane Mythic Plus legendary. Despite the nerfs, it does work very well in a combination of funnel damage and AoE damage. You alternate finishing with a single target ability on the primary big target of the pool in Mythic Plus with chunking down a massively empowered Earthquake for, overall damage. It is very good, it is going to still be very good in raid encounters as well. As I mentioned, not that it's very good for yourself, but it's going to be better for the community perception. As we know, community being dumb. Overall damage is going to spike up for Elemental if you play with Echoes of Great Sundering, purely because of the heavy AoE damage you get to do, even in your single target rotation. And honestly, my main positive outlook on Elemental is that they are also very powerful in Funnel and in Castellnatria. Many of the fights, particularly the more dangerous and, progress blocking fights, the toughest fights, the Natrius, Dawn Legion Generals, the Blood Council, Inerva, they're all going to be cleave fights, spread cleave, AoE fights. Large Fist is going to be pure single target, and there are going to be important single target phases, but the ability to funnel will be there. And Elemental is pretty good at funnel, with Chain Lightning for Maelstrom Generation, spreading Flame Shock, going Necrolord for Primordial Wave. They have several good ways to funnel single target damage, which is very powerful for these type of encounters. They have a very good basic kit with pretty good talents. Yeah, there are still some problems here and there, very annoying, but the base kit, the talents and the legendaries are very good, and at the very least for the first tier they are safe from being horribly outscaled by some other specs thanks to some obscene borrowed powers, which is what happened in Nyalota. Elemental was very good in BOD, they were pretty good in Eternal Palace, and then when scaling went out of control they just dropped off a cliff. Now there is a full reset, we start anew, so they are back into a very good position of being in a pretty healthy state, in a pretty powerful state. So to me, with no bias at all, no conflict of interest whatsoever, Elemental Shaman is going to be very good for both Mythic Plus and for raids. That's the call. And with my main spec, we close my personal, subjective and completely unfounded calls about range DPS. We have left behind some of the specs because I don't think there is anything particular about them, either for good or for bad. So this was all when it came to ballsy calls. Now, let me know, which one of your ballsy calls do you expect to happen? Have you uncovered a plot to make a certain spec OP that nobody else has seen? Are you not buying the OP-ness or the flavor of the monthness of certain specs, and you totally believe they will fumble and fall horribly? Let me know. Once again, I am the only one allowed to laugh at you for your terrible opinion. Nobody else can. So feel free to go on and risk it all. Now, I'll be taking my leave. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, 10 days to go and my mains still have not changed.